Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intactivist podcast. My name is Nick. I am here with my guests if they want to introduce themselves.
I guess I'll go first. Uh, this is my first time on the podcast. My name is Liam, and I'm 21, and I'm a student, and I'm pretty new to this whole activism thing, but ready to have a good conversation.
Cool. I'll go ahead. I go by Intactivist Otter. I am in my mid 30s, United States, kind of East Coast area, and I've been doing activism heavily for maybe the past year and a half or so. And I've also been doing restoration for the last 2 years and 1 month.
I'm Wes. I'm from the UK, and I guess I'm here to add a bit of a UK perspective to things, I suppose. I'm 33. Is that a good intro?
Yeah, that's perfect. I
That's
thought
great.
we would start out since this is such like a huge topic uh, this week, and it's affected so many people. Like the insurrection that happened at the Capitol this week. I think that it was totally messed up and out of pocket for these people to just like, you know, promote these odd conspiracy theories and um, like white supremacy, basically. Um, and I think that it is interesting that I saw this sign that someone was holding up there at DC. I don't know if anyone else
I
saw
think
it.
I saw this as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Make American Penis is Great Again. It's like the lone intactivist standing there amongst all the crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's kind of brave, actually, but also weird.
I'm not sure it reflects too well on the rest of us.
In the
Right.
sense that he's trying to associate himself, and yet they were storming the Capitol.
Yeah, like that's not exactly the place for the message. It shouldn't be associated with this, political extremism and delusion that took place on January 6th.
Do you think he's
There have
associating it with the fact that it's sort of a more, not extremist view, but more like niche view or less common view, and he was sort of trying to get his message out there because that was an opportunity for him to do it?
I mean, I'm sure he definitely felt that way. Like he felt like this was a good opportunity.
Because I've seen some of the
definitely
YouTube
makes
videos
sense.
of like, people on like highways in the States with like red stained pants on and stuff, which is quite an extreme like view of that in the sense that, it's very like, blood in your face, like it's, you know what I mean? It's quite, it's
It's a
shock
shock and awe,
tactics.
yeah,
Yeah.
certainly.
I was looking at Nick's face while you were saying that because I not to call him out, but you want to share from your
Well,
perspective.
I
As
think
Nick,
I think it is sort of shocking, but I think it's sort of necessary to like get the message across because people won't care like if you're just holding up like a sign that doesn't like capture their attention or whatever. It's like they look at the red blood stain and it's like sort of like a reminder.
is that sort of a bit different between sort of US and UK politics in some way, where there's in the US they try and be as, in the face as possible, whereas in other places it may be a bit more subtle
Well,
in getting
yeah,
that message
yeah,
across.
because people in America are like in their own worlds or whatever, and they pay attention to what they feel is important to them. So you have to really grab their attention in a way. Yeah.
Why do you think that is, that they're in their own world?
I don't know. It's sort of weird to describe the sense of freedom that Americans have.
Mm,
It's interesting. And I think during the insurrection, it's sort of related to that because
yeah.
people are like holding on to their freedom or their idea of their freedom.
It's interesting because I had a debate with a friend the other day about freedom of speech and how, like in the UK, you kind of feel like you have the freedom of speech, but it's also very much limited by the fact that, you know, you can't necessarily be insulting, you can't necessarily be like telling anyone they should commit a crime. So it's like you have freedom of speech in the UK, but it's very limited about what you can do. Whereas in the States, because like it's isn't it enshrined in the Constitution, where it's almost felt like freedom of speech has like no limitations at all, and you should be able to do, say, what, anything in some regard.
Well, and
I
part
think
of it too is if you're to some degree it is like that in the Constitution, but also there are parts that say, you know, if you are threatening others, like say you're putting out, you know, hate speech about a group or something like that, there are limits to it. And I think this group that went into the Capitol with the insurrection was very much into pushing those limits as far as they could. One thing that
Yeah.
jumped out to me, when you look at kind of the history of the Intactivist movement, you know, it kind of started off really quietly in the 1980s and 1990s with just a few people scattered around working through it. But what we've seen the last few years has been this very much kind of in-your-face approach of, you know, seeing things that are posted on the internet of like, you know, very vicious knives and blood and, you know, a kid screaming who's being in the, you know, taking a picture in the middle of the circumcision, or, you know, these very kind of shock and awe type messages, which there's been some debate among the Intactivist community of how effective is that, because there are a lot of people who are very triggered, either having memories of their circumcision or just being triggered by the fact of thinking about it. So it's interesting that this guy was the kind of lone person in all of the insurrection standing up holding the sign. And I actually had a few people who I posted it on my Instagram, and I had a few people who contacted me and said, you know, we don't support what happened to the Capitol. You shouldn't support what happened to the Capitol. And I said, I don't support what happened to the Capitol. I am looking at the boldness of this guy who's going out to protest something totally different, but is still kind of taking a stand. And this is America in 2021. I mean, it's just so interesting.
I guess there the comment is kind of, do you, Intactivism as a movement, does it want to be associated with that? Because like in the UK, for example, when there's been a scandal that's happened with a celebrity who may endorse something, the first thing they want to do is distance themselves so much from that, because they don't, even if it furthers their movement, gets lots of pictures in the press and stuff, they don't want to be associated with something that is bad. So
I think part of it is the Intactivist movement right now is kind of a fractured movement. You have some of the main big groups like Intact America and Your Whole Baby and Bloodstained Men, which are all doing amazing things, but they're all kind of, I don't know how much they interact with each other. And then you've got a ton of kind of solo Intactivists like myself. Like I run an Instagram and I post memes, and I come on this podcast, and that's kind of, you know, my iron. I don't feel like there's, I feel like your question, Wes, in terms of like, does Intactivism want to be associated with it? I think there is a very radical kind of almost like fringe movement of intactivism that does. And I also feel like there's kind of more moderate intactivism that's leaning a lot more towards like political policy and peer-reviewed research and those kind of things, trying to document and kind of reach that more moderate academic kind of population.
Yeah, because I guess it's quite easy for because I've watched quite a few YouTube videos about this, and it's quite easy for people to say quite emotive and somewhat hateful language at times, depending on the perception of the person that's listening to the comments from the Intactivist that may say you're mutilated or something. And there is quite a sort of extreme view that could be taken versus a more moderate one where it seeks to educate and inform rather than make people feel like then they've been mutilated or something, which isn't a nice feeling. It's a negative viewpoint of it.
Yeah, I think that comes from honestly just that a lot of intactivists are like really emotional in their work, and that what they're doing on a daily basis by like even talking about this and talking about their own experience is kind of putting their heart in their sleeve and just kind of like shedding all this like pain and trauma they felt. And some people are more capable of doing that in a healthy manner, and for some people it's kind of too difficult to not just be angry and kind of vitriolic in their backlash against what they feel like has been done to them. So it's kind of like a personal issue at that point for different people and how they handle it and how they approach kind of informing people. And I think that it's something that changes over time. Like I think you'd see with like people who are more experienced in intactivism and spent more time, more years talking to people and talking about this, that they're going to be more civil in the way that they approach people and discussing it with people.
I've noticed a big difference, if we're talking about the term mutilation and how it's used in intactivism. There's a big difference between women using the term versus intact men who have not been circumcised using the term versus circumcised men who are intactivists. And I feel like mutilation is used a lot more by circumcised men. And I on one side, I see the respect thing, and I think it shouldn't be necessarily projected onto people who don't feel that way. But as a person who does feel that way, when we look at mutilation in terms of what it actually is, it is destroying the function of something. And we know, based on what circumcision is, it destroys the normal function or many of the normal functions of the male genitalia. And so from my perspective, I am okay with the term mutilated. I am not okay with projecting that term onto others who may be fine with how they are, because there's a whole group of circumcised men who know about intactivism, who understand and maybe even support the movement, but who personally say, I'm fine with how I am. And I think, if we go around, pointing fingers at them saying, you're mutilated, and they are fine with how they are, I think we shouldn't be doing that. But at the same time, I feel like someone who really does feel like this was, inflicted upon them, if it was inflicted without their consent, which again is the standpoint of where I am fine with circumcision if you are an adult male or even a teenager who's informed enough to know about the risks, and you choose it on your own. If that's your choice, you go right ahead. That's no problem to me at all. But all these men who have had it done to them against their will as children, if they want to use that term mutilated, I'm totally fine with that, as long as they don't project it onto others.
I think that's a good way to put it, and I totally agree. And I just want to mention one thing. I think it's interesting that some Intactivists sort of are concerned about that sort of association with like the whole insurrection, because um, there are a few people out there who are, you know, susceptible to like conspiracy theories and things like that. And I think it's important to sort of know that, um, you know, that's not what we all stand for. um,
I'd
also,
agree with that. Sorry, go on.
also like projecting like mutilation or being mutilated onto other people is, um, you know, not something that I think is totally right. I think that it's sort of a sensitive topic to talk about, and I think it's sort of pointless to, you know, try to convince someone that they are mutilated or whatever, um, when they think they're not. Um, and I do think that people have the right to choose for circumcision, but I just don't think it's right to like do it to babies and things like that.
I'm interested. So this week I had some time to chat with Wes on some of his viewpoints, and I was curious, Wes, would you be up to kind of sharing some of your background and view, and maybe we could start some conversation off with that?
Sure. So I am circumcised. Um, I had to get it done as an adult for health reasons, and in the UK, it isn't routine to be circumcised. And I say that in the sense of in the United States, quite often routine means to look like dad, or to not get bullied in school, or to get more blowjobs from the girls or something. Like quite often that is usually the motivation for like doing it in the States. Whereas in the UK, it's a lot like the people that have it done when they're younger, usually it's for religious reasons, or I don't know, because of parents thought it would be healthy for their child to get it done. Like that's the only reasons it really gets done in the UK, like for medical or religious reasons.
I have a question about circumcision in the UK. There are some cultures, like in Scandinavia, there it's not a prevalent problem in society as a cultural norm, and I think that the mindset of the people there are that in such a small demographic of people that practice this, that it's not really worth their time to concern themselves. And that's really an injustice to those baby citizens. But in America, it's on the other way. Is it that way in the UK that the circumcision rates are so low that most people just really don't see it as an issue worthy of paying any interest?
It's an interesting perspective. I think in the UK, because of our healthcare system, it means that you only get procedures performed, such as circumcision, um, if there's like a medical justified need to do it on the national healthcare system, which means that the majority of people don't get it done unless they have a health need to get it done. So in the UK, if you are circumcised, your perspective is quite a lot different compared to, say, somebody in the States that had it done for a routine reason. So you tend to find that circumcised guys in the States, sorry, in the UK, are actually happy or satisfied, at least to have had it done, because the majority of the reasons are medical. So they're usually kind of more in favor of it because they've had problems or suffered through it. So the perspective is quite a bit different in the UK versus the US, where you have a lot of people like for example, like there could be a lot of people that had it done routinely in America. They were unhappy it was done for the motivation to look like dad or something like that. But then if they hadn't had it done, they may have had to get it done later, and then maybe then they'd have a different perspective of, oh, it was painful getting it done later. Whilst it was necessary for me, maybe getting it done as a baby would have been, easier for me. So it's like it's that obviously it's like an unknown. You don't know when you're a baby whether or not you'll have a problem, but when you've had a problem, you almost kind of wish, oh, I wish it was fixed earlier. So it's that sort of, there's a very different mindset, I think, in countries such as the UK that don't do it routinely.
Wes, if you don't mind me asking, can we talk about the medical reasons, like the medical
Yeah, I was
justification
curious
as well?
too.
Because if
Yeah.
my assumption, and this is just an assumption, is that you and probably the other men in the UK that you're talking about were suffering from phimosis. That's the usual medical justification for circumcision, and I'm not sure, like, if you were made aware at all, whether that be by the doctors or just by independent research, of like any other methods or medical responses to treating phimosis that weren't kind of this, what I would imagine to be, or should be at least, in my opinion, a very much last resort kind of radical procedure to tackling the issue, that being just cutting it off, right? Usually when we have a medical problem on our body, we go to the doctor and they don't come first solution, let's just cut it off. That's usually not what happens. So it's, for me, the whole issue of medical justifications for circumcision is really interesting, and I'm curious about your experience and about what you know. So
Yeah, so it's very interesting in the UK because there's always this perspective of the NHS, which is the UK's National Health Service, is that um, they they only do things as a last resort. So in some ways, you'll kind of suffer through it until it gets to the point where, okay, something has to be done, and that's usually because it's a free healthcare system, so there are waiting lists and priorities. So when people get it done in the NHS, quite often that's because they've already waited a significant enough period of time where they've had a quality of life issue, like they've maybe not been able to enjoy sex, or not been able to have it frequently enough because they've had problems. And GPs, they always try and go for the lowest common denominator of trying to prescribe creams and exercise and all that sort of stuff. So in the UK, it does tend to be that if you do get it done, it's either because it's a last result from your doctor's perspective, or you as a guy kind of think, I've gone through enough, I want it fixed, rather than suffering another 12 months of trying to do stretching exercises that you may have already been doing for 12 months that haven't had the desired effect that you want. So like so I do understand the perspective, and in the UK it is very much considered a last resort. Like I have chatted to some like US guys where they've said that they've had sort of a minor problem with sex, for example, that could necessarily be cured by circumcision, but also could be cured by loads of other different things that are non-invasive. And the first option from the US GP is circumcision without even offering other courses. Whereas in the UK, it's very much you're offered the other courses, and only after you've gone through them and waited a period of time do you actually get the option to have it done. So there is, I think, a lot more consideration here, which maybe there isn't with some doctors, maybe in the US, and that could be to do with with some of the stuff with the US insurance, where they'll be able to put an insurance claim in for circumcision and gain thousands of dollars as a result of that, whereas there isn't any sort of motivation in the UK healthcare system to go for like a most expensive option that could be good, even though that's very unethical. I have heard US people describe some of the US healthcare system like that.
Yeah,
if that answers your question.
That definitely happens, and that does answer my question. It's definitely good to hear that the practitioners in the UK are a lot more responsible, at least, than a lot that we've heard about doctors in the US and their approach to circumcision as kind of a first resort for any kind of penile problem. But another thing I was wondering, and if you're not comfortable discussing this, that's totally okay. But I was just wondering, like, how, like you were talking about in general, how like a guy might be suffering or frustrated for a long time before they eventually decide to go through with this procedure. And I was wondering, like, if you could talk about your suffering and frustrations and how like phimosis or whatever like was affecting your sexual health and your ability to enjoy sex or enjoy masturbation or anything like that, if you're comfortable discussing that.
Yeah. So so I didn't have phimosis, where it's impossible to like retract the foreskin. I had problems with having a short frenulum, as well as problems with foreskin swelling that led to paraphimosis, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but that's almost a more dangerous type of like phimosis. So for me, like having sex or masturbating or whatever, you had to be careful. So in the back of your mind, you had to be like,
hey, can I interrupt you real quick? And
sure.
let's define those conditions. I believe the frenulum you're speaking of is called frenulum breve, which is a kind of, it's equivalent of an infant being tongue tied by the frenulum under the tongue. Correct?
So on a penis, there is also a frenulum as well that attaches
Right.
between the foreskin and the head.
And
So
if it's short, it's called a frenulum breve, which is the
I
same
think
thing
so.
as a tongue tied baby.
Like if it's shorter than normal.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty common thing in infants to be tongue tied, and they have trouble sucking and
Yeah.
speaking.
Yeah, because I know of like a
And
child that had to have it done because they had problems breastfeeding because they weren't able to get enough
and
suction.
to solve that, they clip the frenulum or take a cautery and just numb it and burn it, and it frees the tongue up to function normally, which is the same procedure used to treat frenulum breve of the glands, penis, and foreskin. They take a cut, numb it, and it's an office procedure. Minimal. And the paraphimosis is where there's a stricture of phimosis of the dartos fascia at the end of the foreskin, where it doubles over at the lip of the foreskin, and when that is retracted back behind the glans penis, it gets stuck, and when it swells a little bit, it cannot pull it back forward into its normal position. Correct?
Yeah, they would be good definitions.
Okay.
I was just curious as well. I know some types of phimosis can actually be caused by forced retraction as a child. So with American doctors, sometimes you'll have kids who are, 0 to 5 years old that they go into the doctor's office, and the doctor will actually forcibly retract the foreskin, with some crazy excuse of, oh, we just need to make sure everything's clean or make sure everything's all right. And when they do that, because the foreskin is normally adhered to the glands, and it's totally normal for it to not retract even up to, say, age 12 or so. They can cause some phimosis as a result of that. So I wondered, Wes, do you have any memories of like having to have had forced retractions that caused any of that?
No. So in the UK, because non-circumcised is the norm, that's never something that like a doctor would do. So even like, you know, when I had like physicals or whatever as a kid, like I remember it was more that you had to do something that felt comfortable rather than the doctor would never like force anything. So that isn't really something that happens in the UK. I can understand in the States where maybe a lot of doctors aren't necessarily familiar and therefore try and do that, which then causes problems. Like I can understand that perspective, but it doesn't really happen in the UK. And from what I've seen recently, from a positive standpoint, is that a lot of doctors in the US, because the rates have dropped now, are a lot more educated. So if you are a newborn in the States now, you're far less likely to encounter something like that compared to when I guess all of us were kids, where that may have been more prevalent because of like their inexperience.
There were a couple things that came to mind as you were talking about that, Wes. One of them was when you were talking about circumcision for medical reasons. And I know in the States here, a lot of times our doctors will justify that and say it is for medical reasons. One of the things that came to mind was the statistic, I believe it was out of Finland, where they said it was 1 in over 16,000 boys on average needed a circumcision for some kind of a medical reason. And so that was, you know, that's very different compared to what we hear in the States, where you know, I think it is very profit driven because we've got a for-profit medical system here, and you know, we've got doctors getting money in their pockets for doing this, and we also have kind of a lot of disinformation out there as well in terms of you know, at least now the AAP is saying that routine is not recommended, that there's not enough data to justify routine circumcision. It is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because like I wouldn't consider myself an intactivist because I am circumcised and had to get it done, and I guess I'm happy because before it wasn't very good. So like I guess I give a different perspective on the things, but what I do agree with is the motivations behind it. So you brought up the fact that it's kind of profit driven in the States, where, you know, doctors offering it will get paid as a result, and a lot of the motivations to do it to routinely is because, you know, to look like dad or to fit in at school and all those sorts of things. Like I completely disagree with all of those perspectives, but I don't necessarily, you know, disagree with circumcision. I just kind of disagree with those non-justifiable motivations that are behind it, which agreeably, if you were done as a result of that, which I assume some of you are, then like I completely understand that justification of being upset and unhappy as a result of it.
Yeah, and I think like just that Otter mentioned like that statistic out of Finland, like 1 in over 16,000 medically necessary cases in a population where obviously it's not being done to infants, you know, that's kind of shocking. And when we like we're all of us in this group are okay with the idea of the procedure being available to that one person in the 16,000 when they inevitably grow up and they need that to happen for them. But we live in a radically different situation here where as we speak there are, you know, thousands over the course of the year, potentially millions of, you know, defenseless infants who are having this kind of lifetime torture inflicted on them for absolutely no reason. So the degree to which we have to oppose this as a kind of form of genital mutilation and not just something that, hey, like, we have to say something about this, we disagree with this, like, no, this is like a human rights crisis. This needs to end like now. So it's hard to come at it from a perspective that's really moderated when we're living in a situation where, like, as we speak, there's nothing we can do to protect these defenseless infants and protect their rights.
Yeah, I completely agree, because it's not possible for me to have your perspective because it's so different here, and my interaction with circumcision has been so much different. It's just one of those things where the movement in the States and how emotive it is almost kind of characterizes the circumcision as being evil and hatred and all those bad words, and that isn't necessarily the perspective that I have. It's more about the motivation or the justification of doing it, and that's why I think some of the Intactive movement, at least from a UK perspective, it almost comes off, I don't want to say as an extremist movement like with the bloodstained men and all that, but it comes off as quite a like an extreme viewpoint. But that's, I think, in part because we don't understand from the routine perspective in the States. But in the same perspective, if you are going to approach somebody within the States that is circumcised and try and convince them towards your cause, kind of calling them mutilated almost, I think, would turn me off from the cause and make me run away from that perspective, rather than a more moderate approach where it more be about education, where actually, is it the long game of giving me another perspective? So even if I made that decision, I would do so in an informed way rather than doing it as like a default option.
No, I think all of us here are not exactly like likely to go into any random conversation, just coming at, hey, you're mutilated, you're mutilated, you're mutilated. I think that, and as funny as harsh and as difficult as that approach may be, and how unlikely it is to be successful, it still serves a function, because you can get that drop in the bucket in someone's head. Like, this guy thinks I'm mutilated. I don't think that, but I really reject that. But hey, maybe like they can't get it out of their mind. Weeks down the road, they're like doing some research on it on the internet, and they find out, hey, fuck me, I'm mutilated. But obviously, that's not the approach that I would take. I can understand why the Intactivist movement in North America would come off the way it does to you in the UK. But yeah, from our perspectives, it really feels like something that's dire and something that's really extreme. And that, and in terms of like just like human rights, like catastrophe on a massive scale, like, I don't, not only is the anger and kind of vitriolic response like inherently justified, regardless of its kind of rhetorical effectiveness, like, I think people should be way more angry. Like, there should be an entire group of people outside the Capitol protesting just this.
Well, and I think part of it is, and for our listeners, probably there are some of our listeners who, one of the big problems with circumcision in the United States is so many people don't understand exactly what it is.
Yes.
And there are even whole subsets of boys whose families never tell them that they're circumcised. They see a scar on their penis and they think that that's just how you're supposed to be. They think that that's what every penis looks like, because when they look at medical books, when they look at, different resources and things, that's what they see. And that's just,
the propaganda goes so deep that like, I remember being in, my health class in like the 7th grade, And, you know, the diagram, we'd show the diagram of the vagina and the whole female reproductive system, and they'd show the diagram of the penis and the male reproductive system, and the penis was circumcised in the diagram. And I thought that, like, at the time, I didn't think too much of it because I was circumcised and I thought I was normal and I thought this is all normal. But when it kind of hits you and you realize that this is totally not normal at all, and then the fact that it goes so deep as to be like our, you know, my public free education, the health class, they wouldn't even teach us the real anatomy of the penis. Like, they probably didn't even know that they weren't teaching us the real anatomy of the penis. Like, how, it's just completely insane.
And when we go, you know, for our listeners who are not really understanding what circumcision is and going, why do you call this mutilation? You know, one of the things I always suggest is I say go on YouTube. There are several videos of infant circumcisions. If you can stomach it, go on and watch one of them and see what's happening. But just for a quick kind of, you know, explanation of it, these infants are tied down on a board. So they have a board where their legs are secured and tied down. For the, I believe it's 60% of boys who don't receive any kind of anesthesia, they go right into the surgery. For the 40% of boys who do receive anesthesia, they either put a topical cream on the penis or they inject a lidocaine solution directly into the penis, which is very painful as well. And then they go through the process of ripping the foreskin from the glands that is adhered to the glands, just like your fingernail is adhered to your finger. So this would be like someone coming and ripping your fingernail off with a pair of pliers. And then they crush it and slice around it. And really, the thing with this, when we were looking at the statistics from a few years ago, with regular pediatricians, it's only about 40% that use any kind of anesthesia. And if it's an obstetrician, there are obstetricians who also perform circumcisions. One study showed that only 25% of obstetricians used any kind of anesthesia at all. And even the anesthesia that is there, the reason anesthesia was not used for so long was because it was thought that babies did not feel pain, that their neural system was not completely developed enough, and that it just did not inflict any kind of pain, and that they were crying because maybe they were, you know, wanting to nurse, or maybe they were wanting their mother or something. Now we know with the studies that are being done with neurology, even looking at the infant brain during circumcision, and they've done MRIs to study this, the pain that's being felt is equivalent to an older person, if not more intense. And so what we're seeing from this, and I'm channeling Carter here, this penile modification mutilation surgery, as we are seeing trauma in the brains of young children that are changing the way the brain interacts. And we're seeing lifelong changes, especially from, now I don't know if this is the same, I would assume it's not the same as someone in their, you know, teens or adults who for a medical reason chose to have it done. But for the children who are strapped down and having this done with little to no anesthesia, we're seeing major trauma in the brain. We're seeing anxiety and depression and PTSD kind of flashbacks that are coming back as adults. And yeah, go ahead.
I have a comment on that. In Denmark, the current recommendation by the Danish medical authorities and anesthesiology boards are that the only safe way, or the most safe way to do a circumcision, is to be under complete general anesthesia. That would mean being on a ventilator with anesthesia gases in an operating suite, and not on someone's kitchen table at home, which is where a lot of circumcisions happen because it's totally unregulated. Sometimes family members do them, recommended moils without any kind of accreditation. You know, they do them in homes.
And we've had children who will, you during this procedure, they will vomit and choke on their own vomit. There have been kids who scream so hard that they have lungs that collapse. There's also been kids who scream so hard that their eardrums bust. There was a article not too long ago about a parent who brought their son in who had been circumcised, toddler, for a newborn check, and they were checking hearing, and they said, "Why are you checking the child's hearing?" Because he seems to hear fine. And they said, "Well, some babies, when they are circumcised, scream so loudly that they burst or partially damage their eardrums. And so now it's routine to do a hearing test earlier to make sure that the baby did not scream so much from the pain that they ruptured their eardrum." And this is the kind of thing that mothers aren't told. Mothers are often told, "Oh, it's just a flap of skin. It's just something small." These are the things that are happening every day, and that people are not told, and doctors don't tell them this, and
Yeah.
and
like what I was gonna say then is whilst I don't disagree with what's been said, I think there is a contrast to consider as well, because a lot of what you said is almost kind of like medical malpractice and not
It
doing
definitely
things
is.
in an ethical way. Whereas in a lot of places, and I hope it's the case in the UK, and at least from what I know and observe it is that, anesthesia is used, it's all done in hygienic circumstances. Whilst I understand your perspective in the States of where, it may not be regulated and all that sort of stuff, I think there is the perspective of it can be done in like a medically correct and right way that doesn't harm the child as well.
Well,
So
I think, just not to interrupt you there, but I
that's
think the
okay.
biggest difference here, Wes, between the potential for like a medically safe and medically justified circumcision is that we're mostly talking about infant circumcisions, in which there is 0% of cases in which there is any form of medical justification for doing this to an infant, right? There's no possible way of knowing if
Well,
an infant has
well,
penile complications down the line.
well,
So
there is some things, like there are sort of some, I forget what the name is now, where there's like a deformity that you need to like use the foreskin to like fix it and stuff. So there are some sort of things, but I was more referring to more like an older child, maybe 5, 6, 7 time frame, having problems where I'd still consider them like a child, but not necessarily like a 14-year-old teenager that had a problem through sort of like, sex or masturbation or something. Like there are indications at different ages, but yeah, I do agree there is a contrast to doing it on the day you're born, where there's no idea whether or not you may have necessarily a medical problem, even though there might be a medical problem that could present itself at that time, but you're not going to know like in detail. But
yeah, and we tend not to act in this kind of like preemptive strike mindset with other medical problems. Like testicular cancer is a lot more common than, say, penile cancer. And a lot of people say, oh, hey, circumcision reduces the chance you're going to get penile cancer. Well, it's like, you don't need two balls. Why not? Let's just remove one at birth because, will reduce your chance of testicular
I,
cancer. And
I,
the
I
argument can
do I
obviously
do
be
get
applied
that
to. So
perspective.
it's kind of like an absurd.
I do get that, and I do agree. But just for a contrast, there are women that have the gene that causes breast cancer that do choose to have a double mastectomy because they want to reduce that. I understand
Yeah, but
it's an informed choice,
they are making a
but
choice, obviously,
yeah,
which
yeah,
is
no,
like the
I completely
dramatic
agree. But
difference.
what I meant is that there are preventative actions that could be taken. But obviously, informed choice is important as a result of that. But what I mean is just there are preventative actions also that could be taken.
Yeah, and then I just wanted to touch on what Otter was saying as well, because he was talking about the potential for these complications, like lung collapse, hearing damage, and all these real horrible things. And this is not even to account for the actual literal complications of the cutting procedure, which is to say that there are numbers of botched circumcisions to varying degrees, whether that means, you're left with skin bridges, or whether that means that they accidentally cut into or cut off the entirety of your glands. So like
And
the risk that's being posed here, especially when you're doing it to an infant where the
Yeah.
penis is so small and underdeveloped that you can't even make really an accurate kind of cut, that the risk here would be so unnecessary and so outweighs any kind of imagined positives or benefits that it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around
I
the way
I
that the American or North American medical community views this procedure as we speak.
I would agree, but again, would kind of state that that's kind of medical mispractice still. Like granted, if the justification is like the routine, that's bad. But again, if they do it badly, then they should get fired, fined, sanctioned, all that sort of stuff. Like there shouldn't be people performing medical procedures that aren't good at their job. But just to add to that, like I have dated a guy who did have like adhesions like on his penis, like from his foreskin to his gland, but he had actually had it done. He didn't have it. He was in the UK, so he didn't have it done like routinely, like for a justification, like to look like dad, like in the States. But he had it done for a medical reason when he was a kid, like 11, 12 or something like that, and he still had adhesions. Like, and in some regard, that's down to like bad doctor still, even though in the UK the justification was there for medical reasons. Like bad stuff can still happen even in the right circumstance, and it should be. I'm not suggesting that circumcision is should be targeted there. I'm more saying that like doctors still have a right to do it properly, no matter
Well,
what. If you get
And
what I
I,
mean.
and I totally agree that, if we're talking about, again, I think that the difference between an infant versus a consenting teenager or adult, I think that doctors have a total right to, if it's a consenting person who agrees to it, they have the right to do it and to do it effectively. And I think there are, one of the things that some intactivists do is they say that every circumcision is dangerous, and every, American doctors, as they're carrying this out, I don't agree with them doing it, but I do know that the ones that are done in hospitals are sterile. They try to do as much as they can in terms of preventing infection and that kind of thing. But we've also got kind of like, I think it was Tom was saying that, especially the religious circumcisions for Judaism and for Islam. And I'm not speaking anything bad about those religions. I know that it's tradition in those religions. I wish it wasn't. But
same
that
here.
a lot of those are carried out at home. And I think what I run into from the religious side, and even there are some Christians who are doing, our episode last week was all about religion and circumcision, but is this idea that not only do some of these ritual circumcisers, they don't necessarily have medical background or degrees. They have sometimes very, not the greatest tools and that kind of thing, especially if you're in like a developing nation. And the other thing is there is a total chance that the child will have no desire to continue in that religion as an adult if they have it carved into their body. I've talked to several Jews who were circumcised, and some of them are even doing the foreskin restoration now. And they say, I'm not Jewish. I don't believe in Judaism anymore. I was raised in it and I don't believe in it. Or they don't believe in Islam. Maybe they've converted to who knows what, Buddhism or Hinduism, but they still have this religious mark on their body. And it's something that they have to live through with the complications. And just if you're listening to our podcast and haven't listened to it before, The complications we're talking about are a change in the way the penis functions during sex and masturbation, meaning that there is for many men a kind of a muted orgasm. Some men have the inability to orgasm. Some there is friction that builds up because normally the skin would be there protecting the glands, and without it, there's abrasion against clothes. There can also be abrasion during intercourse and abrasion for the partner as well, and that requires us to rely on synthetic lubricants, and some people have even reported erectile dysfunction into their 30s and 40s, which is not a really normal thing. There are doctors now who are coming out and saying, "Oh, it's totally normal to have erectile dysfunction in your late 20s and early 30s." That's not a normal thing, and we're seeing a lot of this tied to circumcision, and so those are some of the complications. And I think the hardest thing is that, at least in the United States, men are so shunned from talking about this. Either one, they're afraid that they're going to be labeled as weak or as gay, or that there's going to be some kind of familial shunning because of this, and I think that's a rough place for a lot of men to be in right now.
Yeah,
I don't. Sorry, go on.
I just wanted to quickly jump in there on a couple of points. One, to talk about the complications, right? I feel like even to say the word complications is kind of a misnomer, because these aren't complications. These are very like obvious things that will happen, that you can observe happening when you do something as dramatic and radical as like removing the entirety of the primary stimulatory mechanism of the penis. And I feel like that's like the most problematic lack of understanding there, is that the vast majority of people in North America, the vast majority of people don't even know that really anything is lost at all. And this is even intact men are have real like no thoughts on circumcision or whatnot, because they can't even really imagine what's different, because what is different is like so radical and so massive. And then just to jump in again on like the erectile dysfunction thing, it seems clear that there's a motivation for at least the pharmaceutical industry that produces these drugs, via Viagra, Cialis, and whatnot, that they're directly profiting off of this kind of crisis of increased rates of erectile dysfunction and other issues of the sorts. And the same goes for the industry, the lube industry as well. So these are kind of industries that are directly tied, whether people are aware of it or not, to circumcision.
To add to that, like I understand your perspectives, but I think it's quite different from somebody who had it done as an adult, who kind of knows both sides of things. Because like, firstly, you talk about sort of like the penis sensation and stuff, and if somebody's lived both sides of the field and potentially had it done for medical reasons, and therefore by choice, because what was before was painful and not necessarily enjoyable, like, your perspective may be that actually it's a lot more enjoyable and sensitive afterwards. And I do understand the whole, like, you lose what, the 15 square meters or wherever the statistic is of it. Like, I do understand the technicalities of it, but from an actual enjoyment perspective, it may be better after than before. And if you've been in a perspective to never experienced the before, then I can understand the potential, like, mental loss of, could it have been better? But in some regards, it may not have been as well, at least in my perspective.
Yeah,
But it is fair. But just before you comment, there's just 1 second point, which is on the erectile dysfunction side, like Viagra and stuff. Like, there's also the same argument there. Like, is it a case of if you're having pain, having sex and stuff beforehand, where you've almost got this mental thing where you're almost having an aversion to sex, because if you're not super careful, it could be painful. And therefore, is that something that affects your arousal, where actually you might have, you know, you might want to explore Viagra because you want to try and bypass the mental thing of you have to be so careful to not cause like a rip or a problem or some swelling that would lead to something. So I completely understand your perspective, but I also think there is another perspective where you could almost say similar things as well.
I think one thing that you touched on, Wes, that was really important was this idea that, for the most part, men in the United States who are circumcised were circumcised as infants. And so they don't have that dual perspective like you had of what it feels like to have a foreskin versus what it feels like to not. And so for them, for the majority of them, the phrase "it works just fine for me," it's kind of they've never felt anything else, and I kind of hearken it to this idea of, if you've only ever had bread and water and you've never tasted filet mignon, bread and water is going to taste wonderful to you unless you've had the experience of tasting filet mignon. And
Yeah,
so I think part of the reason why circumcision continues, and again we're speaking routine infant circumcision in the States, is because these men who are circumcised, even the doctors say, I'm fine, I don't notice any difference, because they've never felt what it's like. And I'm speaking from the majority of men with foreskin who don't have issues and quite enjoy it. Unless they're going through like a process of restoration, they don't have that perspective to work from. So that kind of builds up their defense of saying, well, it works fine for me, so it should work fine for my son.
And I completely agree. However, I guess what I would counter with the assumption that if you were circumcised at birth, it would be better if you weren't, is that I've not been circumcised at birth and it was worse to not be. So whilst I don't disagree in that it could have been, I just disagree with the assumption that it will always be, because if you had to have it done, it isn't, and therefore it's not like a given thing that it will 100% of the time be better. You could be in that percentage where it's worse, I guess.
Rather unlikely situation, don't you think? It's a bit of an outlier. It's like for someone to consider themselves lucky to be circumcised at birth, because they can see into the alternate reality where they weren't, and they ended up having a lot of penile complications in that alternate reality. But
I mean, I know you're trying to be funny there, and I see your perspective, like, and I can't disagree, but I have seen like American guys, like, because obviously, like, I follow a few like podcast debate channels around circumcision, because I had to get it done, so I'm interested in the topic. But there are guys out there that say that they feel like they would enjoy it less if they were like uncircumcised. So
they
like
must be fetishists then, or
no. What I mean
coping?
is
I don't...
What I mean is like guys that say, oh, like people say that you're supposed to last longer if you're circumcised, which, to be fair, I've not noticed, because it's far more mental than that. But there are people out there that but there are people out there that say, like if I wasn't and I didn't last as long, then I would consider that a disadvantage. But it's one of those hypotheticals that no one ever knows. And
can I just stop you right there, because I really understand what you're saying. Like, I totally completely do. But what I would say is that these are all kind of what they are post facto justifications. So this is men who have had this done to them as infants and are kind of trying to grapple with that reality and are trying to come up with reasons to justify it to themselves, whether that be, I like lasting longer, or women like the way it looks better. those are all post facto justifications. The reality is that if it weren't for extreme kind of medical circumstances like you experienced, none of them would have chosen this for themselves.
Yeah,
There are not men lining up to do this. People
yeah,
do not want part of their penis cut off, right? So these
and
post
I would,
facto justifications are entirely irrelevant.
and I would agree in the sense that if that makes them content in being circumcised themselves because they perceive the benefits and don't consider themselves mutilated, then I'm fine for them to be happy and content
I
with their
agree, but
body.
their children,
But
are at risk.
well,
If they
that's
believe
the
that they're
point I was gonna
they're
make.
better off having had that done to them, then they are putting their children at risk.
And that's kind of the point I was gonna go on to, which that can't be your personal justification for circumcising your son. It's not, because you don't know what their personal perspective would be under those things. So I disagree with routine circumcision in the United States as a result of, it works for me, I want to look like dad, I'll be able to like have blowjobs with girls, like all those like ridiculous reasons it looks better and all that sort of stuff. Like those reasons I don't believe are justified, but I am more flexible to other perspectives where people are doing it because maybe they've had a significant problem and want to spare pain, or doing it for religious reasons. Like I have more appetite for a discussion around reasons that I think are like a more appropriate motivation compared to that. Like I draw it, like what I guess my point is, I draw a distinction between like those two sides of the coin, I guess.
I see where you're coming from. I just
I'm
want to say
wondering
on the religious reasons thing, because you mentioned as religious reasons as being separate from those kind of false justifications.
Well, I think that's in part because like my ex-boyfriend was Jewish, and I have a perspective on what religion, Judaism means.
We're getting
to
into
him.
the meat here. So I'm Jewish.
Unfortunately, I have to
Jewish.
like jump in and stop you guys because like I have to leave.
Oh, that is unfortunate.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, it seems like we're kind of in the midst of this. I'm wondering if we could continue this next week, because I feel like I know
we
Nick
should
has to run, and
we should continue this discussion next week. And I think one thing I want to say is like we're discussing a huge like trade-off here. Like I think people deserve to have the experience of having like an intact foreskin for at least a couple years of their life, and to like figure out if there's like any major issues like a short foreskin or a short frenulum or something like that to like consider medically.
And to be fair, like in Turkey, for example, that's predominantly Muslim, they don't circumcise at birth. They tend to do it when they're older, like around 10 to 12 or something like that. So the decision is in part with the person that's having it done. And I don't like disagree with that. Like, but I guess just based on my experience with my ex who was Jewish, like it's challenging for me to, I don't know, I don't want to tell any religion or any person who follows that religion that they're in the wrong, and
But they are.
There's
So it's okay to tell them.
there's a fine line, right? Because it's like with
Not
my
really.
ex especially, there's no, but like knowing like being in the UK, fighting in the World War and Germany and Holocaust and all that sort of stuff, like it's very emotive, and it's very like if you tell somebody they can't enact something part of their religion, it's not just like the body autonomy.
I mean, we'll come out and say it. There is a sense of anti-Semitism within the Intactivist movement, especially there is a faction of the Intactivist movement that is very anti-Semitic, and I think none of us support that that agenda at all. And that kind of goes back to some of the white supremacist stuff we saw at the Capitol. But
That's
I'd
really
say
interesting.
I'd say we think about, maybe that's something that comes up next week, and is talking about getting more into this kind of religion. And we talked about religion last time, but getting more into kind of like, what's the religious background. And Nick, I know you got to run, so
Yeah, I was saying to Nick, I kind of wanted to get in a bit more in depth on that sort of side, but I didn't realize there was an association with like anti-Semitism with the Intact movement. And then when you linked it back to like the mobs in the Capitol, I mean, this is where it means that people that may be more moderate, that not necessarily are anti-circumcision, but are more about pro-choice about circumcision, that they almost don't want to be associated with something that's on the extreme end of the scale.
Right.
Yeah, I think we can continue this discussion next week, for sure, and hopefully I'll see you guys then.
Yeah, I'm
All right.
wondering whether or not like a bigger discussion kind of like edited out into different topics could be quite interesting as like multiple bite-sized perspectives as well for the future.
Right. I think there's been an idea of like sort of editing and getting like short clips out of this sort of podcast format, but that's like a post production thing, sort of.
Yeah, of course.
Well, thanks everybody. It was, as always, it's totally a pleasure to chat with all of you and to be a part of this. So.
Right on. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.